How's the leg?" Scale laughed and slapped his nephew's wounded thigh and made him wince. "Better than it was," said Stour as he stretched it out under the table. "You're lucky, boy." Scale took another swig from his cup, ale leaking out into his beard. Clover would have thought a man who drank as much as he did would have got better at it, but the bastard couldn't seem to stop spilling. "The young lion could have killed you." "Aye." Stour frowned at the floor, still a trace of yellow bruises around his eyes. "I'd have killed him if things had gone the other way." "Dare say you would have." And Scale chuckled and beckoned for more ale. His old bastards had something smug about them now, and Stour's young ones something grudging. When their master lost, they'd all lost a little themselves. A little pride, anyway. It had been a long time since Clover had seen pride as aught but a handicap, yet some men still loved it more than gold. "The king seems oddly pleased about his champion's defeat," muttered Wonderful, almost without moving her lips. "Aye," said Clover. "Maybe 'cause it gives him a chance to wag his finger and harp on the hubris of youth and go over all he's learned in a long career of draining ale-cups. Even though he was every bit as keen on a duel as Stour. That's kings for you. The shit ideas are always someone else's." Clover watched Stour rubbing at his hurt leg, seemed more tame puppy than great wolf now, thoughtful, subdued even. "Looks like defeat might have finally taught our king-in-waiting some lessons, mind you." "Like it did you?" "Failure's the best schoolmaster, they say." Wonderful nodded, looking out at the room from under her grey-flecked brows. "So the war's over?" "Seems so," said Clover. "A lot of men dead and nothing much changed." "That's war for you. Turns out best for the worst of us. No doubt we'll have another presently." "I shouldn't wonder." "And in the meantime, back to teaching sword work?" "Can't think of aught else I'm fit for that I can do sitting down. You?" Wonderful frowned over at Stour and let a breath sigh through her nose. "Long as I'm done babysitting this bastard, I really don't care." "You could come join me." "And teach boys sword work? You've more wisdom to pass on than most, I reckon." She snorted. "More than you have, that's for sure." "There you go. Like all good partnerships, we make up for each other's deficiencies. You can do the passing of the wisdom, I'll do the sitting in the shade." And Clover took a sup from his own cup and grinned, thinking about being propped up against his favourite tree, the rough bark against his back, the sticks going clack-clack down in the field. "You're serious," she said, eyes narrowed. "Well, I'm not serious. If I've ended up doing things alone, it's more through bad luck than preference." "That, and through killing your friends, anyway." "This is the North," muttered Clover, "who hasn't killed a friend or two?" And they grinned at one another and tapped their cups together. A few chairs down, Stour was frowning into his ale as if there was a riddle at the bottom. "I never lost before. Not at anything."
"Would have won if it wasn't for that fucking witch,"
sneered Greenway, as bitter as if it was him who'd lost.
"Fucking Long Eye or whatever. Fucking cheating, that's what that was. They should all have the bloody cross-cut in 'em."
"There's no rule against shouting out, is there?" Stour spoke soft and with a musing sort of look Clover never saw him wear before. "And I reckon she did me a favour. Losing, it's made me see things a new way, like putting a coloured glass to your eye and seeing the world in new colours, or... No, like taking one away and seeing the world as it is." Scale raised his brows at his nephew. He wasn't the only one doing it. Clover scarcely had room on his forehead for how high his had gone.
"Might be you're more like your father than I thought," said the king. "I knew you were a fighter, but I never had you marked down for a thinker."
"Nor did I," said Stour, his wet eyes bright. "But when you're laid up wounded, what can you do but think? Made me realise the young lion didn't put me in the mud, but we're all heading there sooner or later."
"True, nephew. The great leveller waits for us all."
Made me realise, and Stour stared at his hand as he curled the fingers into a fist.
"You only have a lifetime to make your name, and a lifetime might not be that long." "True, nephew. No one'll hand you a place in the songs. You have to seize it."
Made me realise, and Stour thumped the table. "You can't wait to take what's yours." Scales smiled as he lifted his cup.
"True, Nick."
The word was cut off in a kind of sickly squelch, and the king puked blood and ale, and Clover saw, to his great surprise, that Stour had buried a knife in his uncle's neck. There was a click, and something spattered Clover's face, and he saw the old warrior beside him just got his head split down to the bridge of his nose with an axe. Another was shoved onto the table and had his head hacked off right there. Took 2 blows. Another thrashed as Greenway cut his throat, kicking meat and cups off the table, ale spraying. Another snarled curses, flailing with his eating knife, all tangled up with his own fur cloak, before he got a sword through his guts. He swore and drooled blood into his beard, then a mace stove in the back of his head. One of the king's serving girls had been knocked on the ground, the other was clutching her jug to her chest like she could hide behind it. Scale himself had flopped face down on the table, eyes popping and his tongue hanging out, still weakly blowing red bubbles out of his nose, while bloody ale dripped from the edge of the table with a tap, tap, tap. One of his old warriors was underneath it, crawling, snarling, crawling, trying to reach a fallen sword with his one good arm. He stretched and stretched, like working his fingers across that little space of stone to the pommel was all that mattered. One of Stour's boys hopped over the table and stomped down on the back of his neck, once, twice, 3 times, with a crunching of bone. Didn't take more than a few breaths for the old cunts to be sent back to the mud, the young to stand over 'em with smiles on their red-speckled faces. Clover cleared his throat and carefully set down his cup and pushed back his chair and stood. Realized he still had a half-eaten meat bone in his hand and tossed it on the table, rubbing the grease from his fingers. He felt strange, calm. The axe made a sucking sound as it was dragged out of that old warrior's head. Stour's men turned towards him, red blades in their hands. Wonderful faced him, on her feet in a fighting crouch, sword levelled and teeth bared. "Easy, everyone!" called Stour. "Everyone easy!" And he sat back, the wolf's smile across his bruised face wider than ever. "See this coming, Clover? We don't all have the long eye." For all his high opinions of his own cleverness, he'd been as blind to it as Scale. But he knew if Stour wanted him dead, he'd have been stretched out with the others. So Clover stood there and waited to see which way the wind would blow. "You make out you're a silly bastard." Stour took a little sip from his cup and licked his lips. "But you're a clever bastard, too. The wise fool, eh? Always thought your lessons were coward's nonsense, but looking back, I see you had the right of it all along." He wagged his bloody dagger at Clover. "Like what you said about knives and swords. Spent 20 years training with a sword every morning and every dusk, but I won more with one knife thrust. I'd like you to stick with me. Might be you've more to teach. But, I'll need a show of good faith." He looked sideways to Wonderful. "Killer." She turned, eyes wide. "Clove?" She looked greatly surprised as he caught her in a hug, her sword arm trapped under his left, while he stabbed her in the heart with his right, and the blood gushed hot over his fist and down his arm and spattered the floor. "You have to pick your moment," He'd always said so, told everyone who'd listen. Have to recognize it when it comes and seize it with no care for the past and no worries about the future. He held her as she died. Didn't take long. He told himself he'd want to be held when he went back to the mud, but it was really that he wanted to hold her, needed to. What she felt about it there was no knowing. The feelings of the dead weigh less than a feather. No last words, just a sort of grunt, and Clover lowered her to the ground and laid her in the widening pool of her own blood, her disappointed eyes fixed on some cobwebs high among the rafters.
"Fuck,"
said Stour.
"You didn't have to think about that for long."
No. Clover had seen a lot of corpses, made a fair few himself, but he was having trouble thinking of Wonderful as dead. Any moment she'd laugh it off, make some joke about it, cut him down to size with a raised brow.
"That was cold."
Greenway shook his head while another of the young warriors gave a long whistle.
"Cold. A man has to bend with the breeze."
The great wolf's grin was wider than ever.
"You're a bastard, Clover, but you're my kind of bastard."
Stour's kind of bastard. That was where all his cleverness had got him. There was a bang as the doors were flung open, armed men spilling into the hall, painted shields up, and swords and spears and axes ready. Black Calder strode in after them, eyes wide as he took in all the murder.
"Father!"
called Stour, pouring some ale and holding up the cup.
"Fancy a drink?"
And he drained it and set it down in the spreading puddle of the king's blood.
"What have you done?"
whispered Calder.
"Chosen not to wait."
Stour peeled Scales' fat head from the table by one ear and dragged the chain from around his shoulders, its dangling diamond red with blood. Greenway giggled, and the others grinned, all well satisfied with the outcome. Clover had never thought to see Black Calder at a loss for words. He looked to Wonderful's body, then to Clover, then back to his son, and bunched his fists.
"We've got allies who won't stand for this. There'll be men who won't stay loyal."
"Didn't you hear?" asked Stour.
"I made a friend of the young lion. Won't find a stronger ally than the Union. But if folk want to stick with my uncle, that's fine."
And he showed his teeth, wet eyes bulging.
"They can go back to the fucking mud with him."
And Stour tossed the chain over his own shoulders, the red links landing skewed and smearing blood across his white shirt.
"They're going to have to learn. Times change. And so are you. I'm King of the Northmen now."
Calder's face was pale as milk, but what could he do? Kill his son for killing his brother? Stour was the future of the North, always had been, and with all those old warriors lying slaughtered on the bloody floor of the hall, it seemed the future had come early. A man's worst enemies are his own ambitions, Bethod used to say, and here was the red-spattered proof. Black Calder had ruled for 20 years. With one thrust of the knife, his time was done.
"Your grandfather's dream,"
he whispered, like all his grand schemes could be unfucked, like King Scale could be unkilled. Stour gave a hiss, somewhere between disgust and boredom.
"Folks say a lot of things about my grandfather, Bethod this and Bethod that, but I never even met the bastard."
He winced as he lifted his wounded leg and propped it up on the murdered king's fat back.
"I got my own dreams to think about."
Clover just stood there, the blood soaking his sleeve, turning cold.